The JFK 35 podcast is produced by the JFK Library Foundation and made possible with the help of a generous grant from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
Voten ustedes por el Partido Demócrata el día 8 de noviembre. Que viva Kennedy.
That voice you heard was future First Lady Jacqueline B. Kennedy delivering her husband's campaign message to thousands of Spanish-speaking voters in a 1960 campaign ad.
The Spanish-language ad was the first of its kind broadcasted on TV directly to Latino and Hispanic voters, but it would certainly not be the last. In this episode, we look at how presidential campaigns from Kennedy to today have made special efforts to win the vote among the nation's Black and Latino communities. Next on our special election 2024 edition of JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Jamie Richardson.
And I'm Matt Porter. Welcome to the latest season of JFK 35. This season is a special one for us, where we'll look at the historic nature of the 2024 election.
And we will also look back at how today's campaigns connect to those from the 1960s. We hope you will enjoy this season as we speak with historians, journalists, and other experts to discuss presidential politics from the Kennedy era to today.
In late October in 1960, Martin Luther King had been arrested for participating in a sit-in in Georgia, and he had been transferred to a maximum security prison. With concern for the civil rights leader's physical safety, members of JFK's campaign staff urged him to intervene. This was politically risky. At the time, King was a controversial figure, especially in the South, where JFK needed the support of white voters. Ultimately, he and his brother and campaign manager, Robert F. Kennedy, were able to get him released safely from prison, and his Civil Rights Division was able to use JFK's intervention as a way to show his concern with black voters.
But nearly 15 years earlier, when John F. Kennedy was first elected to office, he was seen as someone who could not understand the needs of black voters. As a wealthy white man representing an almost entirely white district, he was isolated from the issues they faced. To address this, he enlisted support from black lawyer Herbert Tucker for his 1952 Senate campaign. Tucker introduced him to key constituencies of black voters in Massachusetts and organized campaign events. In 1958, Marjorie Lawson, a black lawyer who also supported Kennedy, joined his team. She used her connections to introduce him to black civic organizations, religious groups, and encouraged him to do more outreach to black voters.
By 1960, JFK wasn't well known or trusted on civil rights issues, but advisors like Lawson and Tucker had been laying the groundwork that would be key to getting support across the nation from black voters. Journalist Louis Martin, known as the godfather of black politics, joined the Kennedy campaign and was able to gather positive news coverage of Kennedy in the black press. In October, Kennedy made two key appearances in front of black audiences where he spoke about the president's moral responsibility in the area of civil rights, and what the next president could do to ensure equal access to education, housing, and employment. These words and appearances for Martin were turning points in the campaign.
The story of Kennedy's call to help Martin Luther King Jr. often gets the credit for winning him the black vote in 1960, but that has been seen as a naive oversimplification of what happened. Marjorie Lawson said after that it was not only insulting to black voters that a single phone call could influence the voters, but it was also a great disservice to the people who had worked so hard in the campaign, both nationally and locally. Louis Martin explained in an oral history preserved at the JFK Presidential Library that he also thought the call was not the determining factor for black support for Kennedy.
Now, it is true that the King phone call was that dramatic last-minute touch that did help electrify the electorate, the Negro voters. But I think we would have gotten the most of those votes had we not had the King phone. But nobody, it's one of those hypothetical things nobody will ever know, and we never took any chances anyway. We went for everything.
Joining us now to talk more about the history of black voters' influence on presidential campaigns and how they're playing a role in 2024 is Jelani Cobb, Dean of the Columbia Journalism School and contributor to The New Yorker. Dean Cobb, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Before we talk about Black voters in the 2024 presidential campaign, we like to look back a bit at some of their historical moments, starting with Black voters and the campaigns of the 1960s from John F. Kennedy to Lyndon Johnson, and what that period was like for Black voters as the Democratic-Republican parties began to have a major shift after the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
I think one of the things that's significant is that the 1960 campaign, well, even if you go back and look at the presidential campaigns of 1952 and 56, to go back even a little bit further than, you started with, one of the things that would be striking, given the contemporary political landscape, one of the things that would be striking to people is how closely contested they were. And so you had Republicans, really vying for the Black vote, taking out ads in newspapers, Black newspapers. And, there was one from 1956 that pointed out, said, let's be clear, Democrats just can't be trusted on civil rights. Now, this is because we were in the middle of that transition that really started back in the FDR years and wasn't complete until 1964. That really kind of sealed the door on the political realignment in the middle of the 20th century. So in 1960, when you see Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy campaigning, there's a significant question about where the Black vote will wind up. And don't recall the exact number, but Nixon winds up contesting for a substantial amount of the Black electorate that year, I think, which surprises people. And so in 1964, by the point, that, the election happens, of course, President Kennedy has been killed, Lyndon B. Johnson has taken office. He has kind of taken up the mantle of passing a civil rights bill in President Kennedy's honor, in his name, as kind of part of his legacy. The civil rights movement itself has shifted into high gear. It has more political capacity and more power than it would ever have, again, or had before or since. Really that period between 1964 and, arguably 67, where it's at its zenith of influence. And so, there where you see just the absolute kind of crushing defeat that Lyndon B. Johnson hands to Barry Goldwater. And then you see a kind of distinction, whereas in 1960, Richard Nixon was, vying, and at least viable for a significant plurality of the African-American electorate. By 1964, when Barry Goldwater is the nominee, he's explicitly, on the opposite side, of a civil rights legislation. And, for lots of other reasons, his willingness to countenance the use of nuclear weapons and, other kind of points about, politics that people found to be fairly extreme, make it seem that, the Republican Party has gone off the rails. And so one of the really interesting things that comes out of the 64 election is, parties do autopsies, after an election, particularly when they lose. And in 1964, actually comes out in 1965, looking at the 64 election, the Republican Party really does a bunch of soul searching and says that it has to moderate, it has to do a better job of attracting minorities. It cannot have another candidate like Barry Goldwater and so on. They go in the opposite direction. They really kind of double down on pursuing the strategies that, come to be known as the Southern strategy in attracting people who were resentful over the civil rights movement, who were, nostalgic for the old order, including segregation, people who were nostalgic for the old order, including, potentially segregation and so on. Fast forward to 2012, in the aftermath of the defeat of Mitt Romney, the Republican Party puts out another autopsy that says essentially what that one from 1965 said, that they needed to broaden their base, that they needed to have less kind of antagonistic politics and so on. And again, they go in the opposite direction, with the candidate Donald Trump, who doubles and triples down on the worst instincts that people associate with the party, at least outside of a kind of fairly narrow electoral band, demographically.
And you're reading my mind because that's exactly where I was going to go. There is so much similarity between what you said happened in 64, 65, and then sort of what happened after the defeat of Mitt Romney in 2012. Fast forwarding to that period, that era, but going back 4 years to 2008, how did that campaign, President Obama's campaign, obviously the first time a black president secured the Democratic nomination and then ultimately won the White House, how did that show the evolution and power of influence of black voters from previous eras?
Yeah, and one other thing I'll say just as an additional thing about the point you made, it's also true, admittedly, we don't think of him in this way at all, but it's also true that in 1968, people could look at Richard Nixon and think of him as moderate, in comparison to what Barry Goldwater had been. Now, certainly the kind of law and order politics and, the kind of politics of backlash and the Southern strategy and those things, we don't think of it, that way now. But comparatively, he wasn't talking about dropping nuclear bombs on anyone. And he wasn't overtly using the language of opposition of civil rights, even if that was kind of, signaled. And so that's part of it. When we look at 2008, the notable thing there is, and Obama recognizes this early on, when he is running, I think it's the year before the election in 2007, and he goes to Selma for the commemoration of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And so he goes to a church and he talks about his history and his indebtedness to the Voting Rights Act, for being able to have the career that he has, and to the civil rights movement more broadly. But specifically, and John Lewis is there at that point, Congressman John Lewis is there. It really is a kind of moment where people begin to recognize that he could represent, he meaning Obama, could represent the actualization of the wildest dreams of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which is to say that the right candidate with an overrepresentation in the black electorate and a significant coalition of Latinos and liberal whites and Asian American voters could win the presidency. And, these things are kind of directly connected to the idea that, African Americans could be a substantial force in American politics and American life that had been, the whole rationale for the civil rights movement in the first place.
Yes. So you have this, as you said, this sort of connection of overwhelming black support, other minority groups gathering together, and then, getting these liberal whites all as one group. And we kind of saw that again maybe in 2020, where we saw really some very influential black politicians, black voting groups push Joe Biden to get the Democratic nomination and ultimately the White House. Some people ask, though, maybe why that voting bloc circled the wagons for Joe Biden, an older white male candidate, when maybe there were younger, other more representative candidates of the coalition, including the now presidential candidate Kamala Harris. What are your thoughts on how the 2020 coalition was built and how that came together?
I think that there are a couple things with the 2020 coalition. First is that, all politics contains an element of pragmatism. There was a real allergy to, so-called change candidates after the 2016 election. Rightly or wrongly, people took from the Hillary Clinton, campaign loss, the idea that the country wasn't ready to elect a woman president, or certainly not a woman president on the heels of a black president. That, there was the idea that maybe even for open-minded people, that was too much change too fast. And so that was, part of it. Another part of it, though, is that in a very significant way, Joe Biden does represent, the power of the black electorate, just on a basic level, because, but for South Carolina Congressman Jim Clyburn's endorsement and, the work that he does to push Joe Biden over the top in that South Carolina primary. As you recall, in the previous primaries, Joe Biden had a very lackluster performance. And then after South Carolina, he is there. He is embraced by Jim Clyburn. He's embraced by the families of the surviving family members of the people who had unfortunately died in the Emanuel AME massacre. And some of those people came out and spoke of their interactions and affections for Joe Biden. And he steams out of South Carolina with a whole new level of momentum. And so even then, and he recognizes this, he owes his success in gaining the nomination to that one moment, of African American voters by and large.
And to get to the media coverage of voters, kind of no matter what demographic or part of the electorate is brought up, it seems that coverage is always a little bit mixed. For example, all demographic groups are complex and they're not monoliths, but oftentimes the media kind of portrays them that way. What do you feel the media does well and falls short when it comes to covering Black voters and the most salient issues in the campaign?
One of the things I think that people do is exactly kind of what you said. One of the shortcomings is that people engage with Black voters as if we are a monolith. And just as there's the cliche story, which, no editor should allow a reporter to say, I went to this diner and I talked to these people. We've all seen that story. There's a Black equivalent of that, which is that I went to this Black church and we talked. You will get a certain cross section of a certain part of the community in those places, but that is not the sum total. And you have a whole diverse array of viewpoints and perspectives and ways of understanding the world that are all under, the banner of quote unquote Black community. So I think that's really important. And the other thing is that, kind of corresponding with that, we sometimes think that we can distill the interests of African American voters down to things that are explicitly African American. And so if you're talking about, the disproportionate impact that the criminal justice system has on Black communities, say, oh, okay, well, we'll talk about that. Or if we're talking about a disproportionate problem with maternal mortality that affects Black women, like, okay, we will talk about that. But the macro issues, of the economy, of healthcare, of the environment, of climate change, of the things that, John or Jane Q. Citizen is really thinking about. Well, the Black, John and Jane, the John and Jane who live in the Black community are thinking the same things. And so I try to push people when I talk with my students, I try to push them to get out of the most reductive ways of thinking about voters.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. And now turning to the Harris and Trump campaigns themselves, what is kind of your opinion of both campaign strategy to reach out and kind of cultivate Black voters?
There's a lot there. And so on some level, the African American vote is going to go to Kamala Harris's campaign by more than 80%, at least, likely more than 85%. And, most of the polling, shows that. That's not what's up for grabs. Inside of that, I think the Trump campaign recognizes that her winning 82% of the Black vote is better than her winning 85% of the Black vote. And so if you can diminish the size of her supermajority, you can eat into the effect that that might carry, especially in a place like Michigan, which might be decided by 10 or 15,000 votes, especially in a place like Pennsylvania, where the margin will be equally narrow. And so I think that the strategies there, on the one side, have been to motivate people. Kamala Harris's campaign knows that she's going to win the Black vote. What the size of that vote looks like is the question, and that's a turnout game. And so if you win 89% of a very small turnout, that's effectively a loss for you. And if you win 86% of a huge turnout, then you are looking pretty good. On the other side of it, I think that, specifically around African American men, we have seen, the Trump campaign, which is exceedingly popular with young men, period. I think a lot of the polling data has shown this, across racial lines. Most notably, of all the segments in which, if you poll, Trump doesn't win any of them in Black America, but for young Black men under the age of 34 is where he is most popular. And so if you see the kind of pushes for this, or the kind of, rhetorical references, certainly highlighting Kamala Harris's history as a prosecutor and working, in as the DA's office and as the AG, thinking that young men, particularly young men of color, may have some wariness about her on that basis. Then there are other things that are just insulting. Donald Trump said that the fact that he's been convicted of multiple felonies would make him more appealing to Black men, which just, as political strategy and as political rhetoric, that's likely to inflame far, far more people than it will appeal to. The statement itself was likely to inflame more people than it would ever appeal to.
Yeah. And looking at campaign events, campaign rallies, what do you think it says about the people they have with them on stage and representatives that they choose when it comes to members of the Black community?
Well, I mean, there's not very many credible messengers, who are standing on a stage with Donald Trump as it pertains to Black people. Most of the Black people, overwhelmingly the Black people who would be attracted to Donald Trump are people who are fairly marginal in Black life. Mark Robinson, the North Carolina lieutenant governor, is not going to get you some huge uptick in support among African Americans. Nor would Ben Carson or Byron Donalds or any of those folk. They're not people who hold significant standing in Black life. On the other side of it, it's not really an equal comparison. Kamala Harris was endorsed by Oprah Winfrey. She was introduced by Magic Johnson. She has been engaged, by radio hosts and television hosts, and the comedian D.L. Hughley, who spoke at the convention, and it's a really very different landscape in terms of how this looks, and part of it is that it's easy to kind of see a level of cynicism, in the Trump, attempts to appeal to African American men because you're trying to take away votes from someone else, not necessarily win them over to your side.
Cynicism, you just mentioned it, and it kind of brings me to this next question, which is both candidates had the chance to speak in front of the National Association of Black Journalists. Trump had the first appearance where he was very confrontational at the event, and it was where he said that viral line about his opponent's identity, where he said Kamala Harris was Indian and then turned Black. That was the quote from Donald Trump. What do you think those two appearances from both campaigns kind of show about, kind of like you said, maybe the cynicism of politics, how they're each, in this last month of campaigning, putting out their messaging for what they want people to see?
From where I stood, and I was literally in the room during the Donald Trump event, from where I stood, the distinction was that when Kamala Harris spoke to NABJ, she was speaking to people in the room. And when Donald Trump spoke to NABJ, he was speaking to an audience primarily outside of the room. Because even for a crowd of professional journalists, I think people were shocked. There were gasps, audible gasps, after he said a number of comments. When he questioned Kamala Harris's racial identity, people groaned in response to that. And, notably, I mentioned the comedian D.L. Hughley. That gave birth to the line at the convention where D.L. Hughley said, Kamala Harris has been Black a lot longer than Donald Trump has been a Republican. But at the same token, this is the National Association of Black Journalists, I would estimate that there were, maybe 800 to 1,000 people in the room, 95% of whom were African American. And so those comments did not play well in that room, but they played much better among his base because he had the appearance of being a person who marched into a ballroom, full of Black people and put them in their place and said things that would make the people in the room feel as if they've been insulted. And there's a certain kind of insult comedy routine that his audience, really responds to. Whereas Kamala Harris, when she visited with NABJ and she did the event in Philadelphia, she spoke directly to, why she was running for president, her policy ideas, what she thought, would be pertinent and relevant to African American voters and so on. It was much more of a straightforward conversation where you were answering the questions that people in the room want answers to.
Yeah. And so if his statements, as you say, are more for his base, more for not the people in the room, not the black voters in the room and the black journalists in the room, but kind of aimed at another thing. And you mentioned, they're playing at the margins when it comes to the black vote, right? They're not trying to get 50% of the black vote, but they're trying to take that edge from being 85 to 82. And there was this poll recently from Politico talking about how it was 90% in 2020, and now we're seeing that drop to maybe 85% support. And we saw President Obama in October. He's out there particularly looking to young black men or young black voters in general who polls are looking at. That's the margin that Donald Trump seems to be inching a little bit away. Why do you think it is that is happening? Is it related to the candidates that are being fielded, or is this a longer term problem for Democrats that they might be losing that edge a little bit that they've had for so long?
I think there are a couple of things that are happening. One is that I do not think they are particular to Kamala Harris. We've seen, declining numbers of black men supporting the Democratic candidate since 2012. Really, it began under Obama, who went from 95% of black men in 2008 to 87% in 2012. Now, some of that was about the fact that in 2008, he got votes from black men who were conservatives, who were likely to have voted for Republicans under other circumstances. And in 2012, those people just, reverted to form. They went back to voting for, the party that they typically associated with. But nonetheless, 4 years later, that number drops again down to about 84% for Hillary Clinton. And then again in 2020, down to 82 or so percent for Joe Biden. And so this really isn't about Kamala Harris. These things precede her. And in fact, in all likelihood, she'll wind up with a higher portion of the black male vote than Joe Biden got last time around. One of the kinds of, it's a kind of push and pull factor here. One of the things that is worth thinking about is the fact that Trump has been so popular with young men. And for young black voters, young black male voters, they are black and they are also male. And so some of the things that appeal to white and Latino and Asian men, all of whom Trump has done disproportionately well with, might also appeal to some black men. Now, it's a much, much smaller portion of the pie. So the question that we could realistically ask is why so few young black men comparatively find Trump's appeals interesting than their counterparts in other parts of the demography. That's another question for another day. The other part of it is, that may be a pull factor. One of the push factors may be the lack of direct engagement with black male voters from the Democratic Party. And, when I've talked with pollsters and people who are conducting focus groups and so on, the people who've been yelling about this for years, saying the kinds of things that are important to, black men across, age lines are less likely to be emphasized, in the Democratic Party's rhetoric. And so, especially things around entrepreneurship, which scores very high with that demographic. And so when you think about, the Democratic Party, its policies as it relates to black men have traditionally just been, criminal justice reform, but not necessarily things around education accessibility, around trades and, trade education and training, around, child support and child support reform. There's been one proposal to make child support tax deductible, which would have a huge transformative impact on the lives of very many Black men because they are less likely than their other counterparts to be custodial parents, and a whole array, a whole slate of things, some healthcare issues that specifically affect Black men, like, or disproportionately affect Black men, like prostate cancer. And so if those things come to the fore, you might see, a reversal in that trend.
And, you kind of already talked about it, but, we talked a lot about postmortems. We talked about the postmortem for Republicans after 1965, the postmortem in 2012 for Republicans. If whichever party loses, for the final question here, what do you think is going to be on the top of each party's postmortem if they lose this election in November?
I think that if the Democrats lose this election, they're going to have to go back to the drawing board to figure out. So they have a particular problem, which is and it would be highly likely that Kamala Harris will get more votes than Donald Trump, numerically speaking. They have the capacity, the Democratic Party has the capacity to win majorities in presidential elections, but lose in the Electoral College. And so whatever strategy comes out of that is going to be calibrated toward finding those electorates in that handful of swing states and trying to lure them back into the Democratic fold. Especially around working class voters, they maintain strength with working class voters who are Black and Latino. They have seen erosion with working class voters who are white. And that may be, another, part of the conversation. Even as we've seen, labor unions, with the kind of ambivalence they've displayed toward Kamala Harris in this election year, despite the fact that I think that Donald Trump has not distinguished himself in any way as a friend of labor. And so there's that. If the Republicans lose this election, I think it will be hard to see them do anything other than double or triple down, because demography is not in their favor. The portion of the electorate with whom they are most popular, which is older white voters, is an increasingly small portion of the electorate. And they might be able to broaden that appeal with a certain kind of bombastic or nativistic demagogic politic that has, characterized Donald Trump. But you really can't flog that horse forever. And I would not really be shocked if we see more emphasis on the kinds of minoritarian policies, like gerrymandering or like curating the electorate in particular ways to make it such that a numerical minority can remain an electoral majority as it relates to Republicans.
Well, thank you so much, Dean Cobb, for joining us. We appreciate you giving all your time to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Black voters weren't the only groups the Kennedy campaign in 1960 made a special effort to reach out to. There were about 4.5 million people of Latino or Hispanic origin living in the United States in 1960, or about 2.5% of the population, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. Among that small population, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, and Cubans made up the majority of the peoples represented.
President Kennedy's campaign felt it could make inroads among the small but growing Latino communities in America. President Kennedy hired skilled advisors from Latino communities, including Pedro Arroyo San Juan, a Cuban-born writer, artist, and veteran who took Kennedy's message directly into Latino communities in their own words. San Juan spoke 9 languages and used his expertise to court voters in New York's Puerto Rican communities.
And JFK had a very unique surrogate to share his message among Spanish-speaking voters, his own wife, Jacqueline Kennedy. The future First Lady also spoke several languages, including being fluent in Spanish. She recorded the first campaign spot broadcast completely in Spanish in presidential election history. In it, she told Latino voters her husband would be, quote, a firm hand and help ensure a peaceful world.
Para el futuro de nuestros niños y para lograr un mundo donde exista la paz verdadera. Voten ustedes por el Partido Demócrata el día 8 de noviembre. Que viva Kennedy.
Those words by Mrs. Kennedy, ending in Viva Kennedy, translated are, for our children's future, and to achieve a world where true peace exists, vote for the Democratic Party on November 8th. Long Live Kennedy. The words Viva Kennedy became a rallying cry in Hispanic and Latino communities across the U.S. The campaign organized support groups aimed at mostly Mexican communities using the same phrase, Viva Kennedy, in southwestern states including California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas.
The Viva Kennedy groups rallied to register new voters in very similar ways modern campaign affinity groups do today. In 1960, they may have played a key role in a state like Texas, where their race was won by only 2 percentage points.
As of 2022, there were an estimated 63 million people living in the United States who identify as Latino or Hispanic, or almost 20% of the U.S. population. The Latino voting bloc is not just an important constituency today, but a potentially decisive one in many key swing states. Joining us to talk about the contributions of Latino voices in American elections is Mike Madrid, co-founder of the Lincoln Project and author of the new book, The Latino Century. Mike, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome to the podcast.
Mike, you have a really interesting biography. You grew up in California, and the first presidential candidate you said you supported was Ronald Reagan. Today, you've sort of turned against the current Republican standard bearer, former President Trump, and co-founded the Lincoln Project, which is a group of Republican strategists organized against Trump. Can you tell us a little bit about your career in politics and how you ended up where you are?
Sure. And again, I grew up in Southern California in a home of Mexican-American Catholic Democrats. We're very working class in a time when Southern California was really expanding greatly, not in small part due to the expanding defense spending of the Cold War. California was the largesse of Reaganism and the Cold War economy. It was an economy built largely by blue-collar manufacturing, Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, Lockheed Martin. And as I grew up, California was becoming more Latino around me. Ronald Reagan, as you know, signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, the last major comprehensive immigration reform measure this country passed. And this tension between kind of Reagan conservatism and changing demography that my family was a part of seemed to flow together seamlessly. I was very interested in sort of the economic aspects of conservatism at that time. And to me, it stood athwart what I saw as potentially great challenges that were coming from the Democratic Party and what that would mean for upward mobility and housing affordability and the quality of our public schools. And so I went to the East Coast. I went to Georgetown University to finish up my undergraduate work, where I was very excited to be engaged in looking at the demography of the country and recognize that somewhere around my mid-50s, where I'm at now, the country would be very close to becoming a non-white majority country, and for the first time in our history. And I wanted to kind of study what that meant and understand what it meant for American-style democracy and our country. And I went back to the East Coast. Back to the West Coast, where I was from, where this was all going to happen first. Was engaged in Republican politics, but built some very, very strong relationships across the aisle with very prominent national Democrats now. U.S. Senator Alex Padilla is a very good friend of mine. I've known him since our early 30s. Members of Congress, Democratic members of Congress, call me regularly for advice and ideas. I ran Antonio Villaraigosa's campaign, the first Latino mayor of Los Angeles. He ran for governor in 2018, and I ran his campaign. So I view myself much, much more as an advocate for my community and policy, and that's allowed me a very unique role in American politics because I have worked for Republicans. I worked for George W. Bush in his campaigns, worked for the Republican leader in the California legislature for many years. But I'm also more than happy to work for Democrats if I believe that the policy prescriptions are right. And in a time when partisanship really doesn't allow for that in this country, I think I've had a unique front row perspective from both parties on how they're engaging Latino voters, and I decided it was time to write a book about it.
So thank you for that introduction, and really great to understand where you've come from and where you're at. So in your new book, you say we are in the, quote, Latino century. What do you mean by that, and why do you think Latino groups are growing in so much power in this particular century?
Well, the Latino population is growing dramatically, expansively. It will never be a majority or even probably a plurality by the end of this century. But what it is doing is it is kind of forcing a reckoning on race and ethnicity and the way we perceive minority communities in a way that is very unique for this country. And that's why I titled the book The Latino Century. along with a kind of a neat fit with the first time the American century was coined after the Second World War, almost 100 years ago, when the idea of Americanism was an optimistic, hopeful enterprise where we could kind of use those values to elevate and lift the human spirit. And I really view the changing culture driven by Latinos putting the Latino community at the forefront of that same type of change for this century. And I say that because, first of all, 80% of the population growth in this country is Latino, which is an extraordinary number. In about 8 short years, America will be a non-white majority country for the first time in our history. And that's going to challenge the very notions of what Americanness is and the way we perceive diverse communities. For most of our experience, our frame of reference on minorities has been black and white. The first chapter of my book is titled Beyond Black and White. The Black population has been about 12% of the American population for the better part of 150 years. It hasn't grown much. It hasn't declined much. There's never been a numeric threat of racial change in this country. And threat is a word I use because so many people perceive this as a threat. But that is changing. But the growth of non-white peoples is not coming from the African-American contingency. It's coming from Latinos largely. Asian Pacific Islanders are starting to expand in great numbers as well. But the cultural changes that we're about to experience, certainly the political throes that we're in the middle of, are driven almost entirely by Latino population growth. And that's the main reason why I titled the book The Latino Century.
And I wanted to go back to kind of the mid-century of the 20th century to kind of get some context. You mentioned that there's a lot of focus on Black voters and how their history has been. But what the mid-century, where were Latino voters or Hispanic populations?
In the 1950s?
Yeah, 50s, 60s.
It's always been in the low single digits up until very, very recently, where Latinos surpassed the African-American share of the vote. In 2020, for the first time, it surpassed them in population numbers a few years before that. So the growth, when Latinos have emerged as the largest ethnic group in this country very, very recently, within the last 5 or 6 years. And so most of this population growth has largely been a function of the last 2 decades in this new century. Prior to that, in the last century, Hispanic and or Latino numbers hovered around 4, 5, 6% of the population. In 1970, the term Hispanic was actually created by the Nixon administration to start identifying for census purposes people of origin from Spanish-speaking countries.
And when did Latinos or Hispanic voters, as you just said, the Nixon era term, voters get recognized as a bloc that'd be important to the political parties and their candidates?
That's a great question. Some would suggest that it still has not happened, right? So the answer to that is subjective. What I will say is the 1960 campaign was the first campaign where you saw a political advertisement in Spanish. It actually came from soon-to-be First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, who spoke Spanish, who did a black and white ad in Spanish to appeal primarily to Latinos, Hispanics, in the Southwest, New Mexico, Texas, California, Arizona. But again, very, very niche part of the electorate at that time. Grew in importance during the 1970s when Bobby Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, joined Cesar Chavez in the United Farm Workers strikes in the Central Valley of California, which really kind of catalyzed the modern consciousness of the Hispanic voter. By the way, the overwhelming number of Latino voters are of Mexican descent. It's about 60% of all Latino voters are of Mexican descent. And it's not that number is so big, but when it's compared to every other group, no other group meets double-digit numbers. So it's overwhelming, not because it's so sizable at 60%, but because every other group is so small. Puerto Ricans are second at 9%, and of course, Puerto Ricans are already American citizens. Behind that are El Salvadorians and then Cubans at about 6%. And then everybody else is kind of in the low single digits. So a lot of what we're watching with this Latinization of America is really kind of the Mexicanization of America. And all of this growth, this rapid growth is largely those of Mexican ancestry. And it's not just isolated to the Southwest anymore. We're seeing huge diaspora growth in North Carolina, Wisconsin, Tennessee, Montana, virtually everywhere now.
Fascinating. And to think, could you speak at all to the Kennedy campaign's efforts in addition to the ad that Mrs. Kennedy did? Did he make the population a priority? You said it was the first ad in Spanish. Was there anything else to kind of supplement that effort?
Well, at the time, the Catholicity was a very important point. This was obviously, there was a point of great consternation amongst some segments, particularly in the South, but also in the Northeast, about a Catholic becoming a president of the United States. At that time, in the 1960s, over 80% of Latinos were Catholic or from a Catholic religious tradition. So there was naturally an appeal there. That the criticisms, I think, or the concerns, I should say, about John F. Kennedy's Catholicity were actually a reason why they were leaning into supporting the former president. So, and just I think just the general approach of the type of Irish Catholicity that he was presenting finds a close nexus with Mexican Catholicism. So, in many ways, it was the natural fit. This Latino vote, this Hispanic vote, finally emerging from the low single digits to be a discernible bloc in key states, emerges at the same time the country's about to elect the first Catholic president. Just kind of a unique coincidence that was mutually, I think, beneficial to both.
So we come from that era, the Kennedy era, moving forward back to sort of today where you're writing. I kind of want to start with this question, which is, what do you think both parties get wrong about Latinos as a voting bloc today?
Let me answer that by saying this. The party that is able to capture the hearts and minds and ultimately the votes of the Latino electorate will be the party that best encapsulates and embodies a multi-ethnic working class. The multi-ethnic working class piece creates a different set of conundrums for each party. So what they both get wrong are a little bit different. For the Democratic Party, they have been struggling with the working class voter for the better part of a decade. And it's not just Latino voters that they've been losing working class, non-college educated voters on. But the country's focus has largely been sort of on those kind of economic anxiety voters you've been hearing a lot about. The New York Times visiting the diners in West Virginia or Ohio and trying to learn more about what they're experiencing, even though they may have voted for Barack Obama, for example, and switch back and vote for a Donald Trump. Like, what was the rationale there? What we've come to learn is this education divide that is really the sharpest demarcation of politicization in this country is obviously affecting Latinos too, but perhaps not in a way that we expected. A lot of this third generation voter is feeling not just the voter roles, but the employment roles of the blue collar working class. Latinos are the fastest growing segment of the non-college educated workforce. And as a result, they're voting very similarly to their white non-college educated counterparts. In fact, from an assimilative perspective, they don't view themselves all that ethnically or racially distinct from their white counterparts. And so they're voting like those on the construction sites or the energy patch or the manufacturing line. They're taking on those characteristics and are becoming the fastest growing group, men specifically, by the way, of the Republican coalition. Republicans, for their part, and this is going to sound a little bit ironic, but Republicans have struggled with the multi-ethnic part. They've really doubled down since 2016 on trying to motivate this same base of white rural voter and have been wildly successful with that. It's really been key to Donald Trump's success in recent memory. The irony comes in is how can you be a multi-ethnic party at the same time your message speaks to kind of a more divisive nativist message focused on whites? And the answer again to this, and the reason I wrote the book, is because there needs to be an understanding that these third generation voters and now a discernible fourth generation voter doesn't see themselves as racially distinct. They overwhelmingly identify themselves as quote unquote typically American. And they're voting overwhelmingly with pocketbook issues and economic populist messages, as opposed to the racial identity and the ethnic messaging that they're hearing so frequently from the Democratic Party. They just don't find it relatable. And they're overwhelmingly voting for economic reasons as opposed to issues that some might view as a racial or ethnic priority, or for attacks even from the Republican Party that some people are saying, how can you possibly vote for somebody who's attacking your race and ethnicity? they just increasingly don't see themselves as anchored racially or ethnically with their country of their grandparents' origin.
Yeah, and it sounds like that, because you have pundits or Democratic leaders who will say something to the effect of, I can't understand why people of Latin American descent or Latinos would vote for a Republican given their hardline stance on immigration and border issues. But it sounds to me what maybe isn't coming across is that these people have been in the country so long that they are further removed from that issue.
That's precisely it. I kind of say in the same way that we don't talk to people of Irish descent about, potato famine policy in Ireland. It's a part of the family lore. It's no longer a part of the aspirational, forward-thinking sentiment of these voters. This was a long time ago. And while there is, I think, more of a sensitivity to it, I don't want to say they're dismissive of it, nor are they, embodying some of these nativist sentiments themselves, although that may be true in some instances. It should not be so inconceivable that these voters are voting more economic and pocketbook when they don't have as much of an ethnic anchor as their grandparents did. This is a typical assimilative trajectory. And in many ways, and I hear this very commonly with Democrats and Democratic leaders too, is how can you vote for somebody who is affecting your family or your family's background? And the answer is, if you've ever lived paycheck to paycheck, the answer on that is pretty clear: is they don't have the luxury of that. They're voting for their immediate interests, and the Democratic Party isn't viewed as speaking to that immediate interest anymore.
And at the beginning of this year, we had the two parties had candidates that were pretty unpopular, with polls saying that the Trump-Biden matchup was one of the least favored, and yet both were chosen as the party's nominee. But now we have Biden stepping aside, and so how does Vice President Harris's entrance into the race change the campaign or not for Latino voters?
That's a really great question. And she has seen a return somewhat to the 2020 levels. For perspective, Joe Biden got about 59% of the Latino vote. This is not historically low, but it's almost historically low. The only numbers that we have was a campaign I was involved in, which was the 2004 George W. Bush reelection effort. That's the last Republican who has hit numbers above 40. Reagan did in 1984. Those are the only two that surpassed that threshold. Donald Trump's knocking on the door, and if Joe Biden had remained the nominee, the polling would suggest he very well may have gotten there. Kamala Harris seems to return some of that drift back to the 2020 range. She's not doing as well as Joe Biden did in 2020 yet. Again, a historically bad number, but the direction at least is heading better for Democrats for the moment. We'll see where this all shakes out. But again, I'm more of the opinion that this rightward shift is happening despite Republican efforts, not because of them. It's part of a broader demographic change, and there may be limits on how much lower Kamala Harris can drive Trump's support amongst Latinos. That mid-30s range, 35 to 37%, may be a new normal for Latinos supporting the Republican Party. That in and of itself is extraordinary. It's a historically high range, certainly the highest I've seen it in my 30 years of working with this voter group, but it makes perfect sense demographically because of the explosive growth of third and fourth generation Latino voters.
This may be you may have kind of answered this already, but Harris has a multiracial background or identity. Is this a factor at all for Latino voters who may have a multiracial family themselves, or do you think that's kind of not a thing because of them seeing themselves as more, I'm an American, and that's it?
It's a really fascinating question, and these are the type of questions that I'm increasingly intrigued that we're going to be asking as Americans is what does this mean, right? And we're struggling with this, and I think all of the best ways. Latino identity, Latinos, by the way, are by definition a mixed race people, mixed culture people, half indigenous, half European. So by definition, we are a blended race the same way that Kamala Harris is. But I do believe that most of her appeal is frankly, it's more of a generational appeal than it is a multiracial appeal. The fact that she's not kind of an older, white, feeble, stumbling, bumbling candidate. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. That's what voters were telling us in polling. I think it's also part of what Trump's problem is. If a younger, more vibrant, more dynamic, more relatable candidate has more initial appeal. It just does, regardless of her policy positions. I also think the fact that she is not white is intriguing because increasingly people under 30 are very comfortable with non-white people. They've grown up in a non-white America in their classrooms and with their age cohorts. So to them, it's not as much of a unique moment where they're seeing something different. In fact, I would argue they're seeing something that they're comfortable, familiar with, and something they've already always known. And the distinctness of kind of an older, feeble, angrier man is probably more jarring than seeing a multiracial woman.
And, we've talked a little bit about the pros and cons for Vice President Harris, who's taken over for President Biden. Let's kind of look at the other side of the coin, former President Trump. What do you think his positive and negatives are individually for him going into November?
Donald Trump's positives or negatives?
For Latino voters in particular.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. And again, I believe, Donald Trump is in a very strong position here to win this race. It's going to be a very close contest. And Latinos, I think, will be determinative. I've never said that in 30 years of being asked the question. And the reason why Latinos will be determinative is because the size of the voting group is outside of what the margins of victory will be in every single one of the 7 swing states that we're focusing on and identifying. Set aside Florida, where will absolutely be part of the margins there. Latinos surpassed the African-American vote in Wisconsin. They will be outside the margin of victory in Georgia, and I think there will probably be a sleeper block in North Carolina. The reason why Trump is in as strong a position as he is and as competitive as the race is because of this higher support level with Latinos, particularly U.S.-born Hispanic men, where he's polling very strongly. In fact, in most polling, he's breaking over 50% with this subgroup, which is pretty extraordinary. And it's coming because, as we mentioned, there's this lack of an ethnic anchor that, frankly, they find the Democratic Party unrelatable on those issues. But the second is this strain of economic populism that is really, I think, taken hold in these industries where Hispanic men are overwhelmingly becoming this workforce. And again, they are the energy patch, working the energy space. Some of the biggest shifts that we've seen to the right have happened in the Rio Grande Valley, in southern New Mexico, in southern Arizona, and in the Central Valley and southern part of California. Those are all energy-producing regions where the economy is reliant on energy production, oil production. We're also seeing Latinos dramatically reshape the workforce of the manufacturing industries throughout the country. And again, a lot of these voters, whether they're white, Hispanic, or other, view the Democratic Party often as an existential threat to their livelihood, let alone the construction trades. 1 in 5 Hispanic men are employed in the construction industry, which is a remarkable number, or related fields like real estate agents and mortgage brokers, which is kind of the first step into the professional class without a college degree. So all of these industries are strongly Republican and moving more in that direction because of policy considerations. At least from their perspective. Again, I'm not making an opinion or a judgment on policy. That's not my area of expertise. But assessing voter opinion of these constituencies is, and that's what they're continually telling us. So Trump speaks directly to that. He speaks directly to these concerns. He's also, let me add one other feature, which I think is really fascinating. There's also a political populist element, which is very resonant with Latinos. The 2 American candidates who have significantly overperformed both conventional wisdom and polling data in this country are Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Both of them, obviously very, very different politicians from a policy and perspective. They're both populists. They're both running against their own party machinery as much as the system itself. And that seems to have found some strong resonance with Latinos under the age of 30 years old.
It's really interesting. And after reading your book and talking to you here, understanding the kitchen table issues being the primary driver, especially for the 3rd and 4th generation Latino voters who are out there. And I think in the end, you have to think about one thing we haven't talked about is the Republicans running these very strong, and also the Harris campaign running these ads regarding the border and the crisis of the border. You have former President Trump talking about holding some of the largest deportations in the country, and after talking with you about how you've made a point that the kitchen table issues are what's more of a concern. Does this mean these type of ads, these border ads, these deportation concerns, are really more aimed maybe at white voters?
It's again another fantastic question, and the short answer is yes. look, depending on the ad and the thematic, I think it is fascinating to see that Kamala Harris is the only ad that she has launched in English only was called Tougher, which was about the very strong border security positions she's taken, hiring thousands of new border agents, shutting down, these points of crossing to the undocumented, cracking down on transnational gangs. It's the only advertisement she is not running in Spanish. There's a reason for that, right? She knows that Spanish-speaking first-generation voter that is more compelled by immigration issues is not going to like that messaging. She's absolutely right, and so it would be prudent to not run it there, not put it in front of that audience. But a lot of her other ads are, focused on the fact that she is the daughter of immigrants. She leans very heavily into that when she's talking to them in Spanish. She'll use kind of Spanish accents, people with strong accents that will narrate the thematics. That's not speaking to an English-speaking Latino voter, and that's certainly not speaking to English voters overall. It's speaking to a very small but important demographic for Democratic candidates. So the campaigns are getting smarter and more sophisticated about this, and they are more leaning into a more nuanced understanding of the fact that the Latino electorate is very, very different generationally, and those that are third and fourth generation should not be spoken to through a primary lens of race or ethnic identity, because it turns them off, and it's been pushing them away for the better part of a decade.
And so no matter which candidate wins, how do you think they should go about constructing their administration to be inclusive to this kind of changing wide Latino demographic and build in the issues they care about most?
Again, another really good question. Let me answer that by saying, we're recording this on Friday at the same time, and I think in just a couple of hours, Kamala Harris will be announcing her economic plan. First of all, the way to appeal to this group is through economics. It's through pocketbook issues. And that is something that, despite 30 years of polling, has told us Latinos want to be spoken to about. So strong is the need to compartmentalize this non-white voting group as a minority group that the response from both parties is always about immigration. Is why don't you want to talk about immigration? Why aren't you responding to immigration when these voters overwhelmingly are telling us they want to hear about pocketbook issues? They want to hear about affordability. They want to hear about jobs and the economy. So the short answer is you've got to have an economic agenda that works for this fastest growing segment of the blue collar working class. The second is there's a way to nuance these racial messages without speaking directly to race. And Harris is actually doing this quite adroitly by launching this first-time home buyers plan. This is actually really unique and I think really quite smart. What she's saying is there's a massive program to benefit first-time home buyers, and especially those that have generationally never owned a home. You'll get a $25,000 down payment assistance plan, and that's speaking overwhelmingly to the Latino demographic. She's not saying it's a Latino housing plan, but by all the other demographic metrics, it's all but that. And that's, I think, the way politicians are going to increasingly speak to this group is, as we become more multiracial, multi-ethnic, there are clear distinctions and needs to address the policy problems affecting or afflicting certain communities without leaning into it through a racial lens. We can address these problems with specific targeting demographically that does not prioritize race and ethnicity. And my hope is for the country, that becomes a healthier way to discuss our differences, because we can ameliorate these problems by economic class. And if we do that, we probably lessen the need or effect of exacerbating racial discord and divisiveness that unfortunately politicians have been more than willing to lead us down a path of over the course of the past 200 years or so.
Mike, I want to thank you so much for spending the other time with us today. It was a really fascinating conversation. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you both so much for the conversation. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you for listening to today's episode in our special season looking at the historic nature of the 2024 election. We will have a new episode each Thursday until Election Day. If you're interested in learning more about some of the topics we discussed today, you can visit our podcast page at jfklibrary.org/JFK35 for this episode.
If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or find us across social media at JFK Library FDN using the hashtag JFK35. If you like what you heard today, please consider subscribing or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.